Unique finishes are all the rage, and there's an amazing craft producer out there that's come out with a very special and unique finished whiskey. And if you want to find out what it is, then stick around. Let's get into what we're talking about today. And the bottle is actually from Woodinville Distillery. And this is their Sauternes finish. So the story is Woodinville is actually a distillery in Washington State. It's about 30 minutes northeast of Seattle. And the region is saturated by wineries. So it's kind of unique that they've got a distillery there. Now, they do use a pot still to distill their whiskey instead of a column still. And generally speaking, pot still bourbons are not my favorite. But these guys do such a good job with it that it just tastes like a bolder version of what we would normally consider a traditional bourbon flavor. And it's not really over the top. So I like what they're doing with their pot. Another thing about this distillery is they source all of their grains locally from the Omlin family. And so all of the grains are actually from Washington State. So they're kind of grain to glass distillery, which is interesting. Another interesting element is that this distillery buys their barrels from a cooperage that air dries their staves. Most of the time, the larger barrel producers use a kiln to dry their staves because it's so much more efficient. But there is some research that indicates that if you air dry your staves, that it will pull out some of the more bitter tannins and some of the negative flavors that might be pulled out of the oak. And there have been some pretty classic examples of distilleries that specifically released whiskey that was air dried and not dried in a kiln. And people lost their minds for that stuff. And this product's everyday product is air dried staves. So that's pretty interesting. They also toast and char their barrels. So think of the difference between grilling a steak for 3 minutes and slow cooking a brisket for, say, 24 hours. That's the difference between toasting and charring. So toasting is going to be a slow cook that will break down the cellulose level of the oak and allow the whiskey to move in and out of the oak and pull compounds out more easily. It also caramelizes some of the wood sugars that are in the oak and adds a very distinctive set of flavors that I think taste like s'mores. But charring a barrel is a fast burn of the inside of the barrel and creates a charcoal layer that will filter out some compounds as the whiskey moves through that charcoal layer into the wood and back into the barrel. So getting into the bottle details, this distillery is Woodinville Whiskey Co. And this SKU is called Sauternes Cask. Now, so you can understand what the significance of these barrels are, because Sauternes barrels are very hard to get a hold of. And Sauternes is a wine region in France. And due to geography and topography, there's actually a lot of fog that moves into the vineyards. And France, is a grape growing country, they are a little bit different than the United States, because here we normally can just look on the label and see what grape varietal is growing there. But in France, there's usually a limited set of grape varietals that are allowed to grow in each region by the definition of that region. And Sauternes is that way. And the grapes that happen to be growing in Sauternes have tighter grape clusters, and the diameter of the grapes are smaller, which prevents airflow from going through the grapes. And so when the fog comes in and the fog encapsulates that cluster, the moisture is able to get in between the grapes and get moisture in there, but there's not enough airflow to dry it out quick enough. And this leads to what's called noble rot, which is a fungus called botrytis. And it will get in there because of the higher moisture levels. And this makes the grapes look unsafe to consume because they literally look like they're rotten. But tradition says that there were Catholic priests in the area that needed wine to perform the communion service that it was, at the time, a lot of the locals believed that without communion, they weren't able to get into heaven. And so if they had a problem where they weren't producing wine for years at a time and there was no wine to do communion, that was going to be an issue. And so finally they were like, all right, let's just go ahead and make some wine out of this and see what happens. And it turned out that the wine was super thick, super sweet, and super delicious. And the reason why that is the fungus happens to remove the water out of the grapes, and what's left is basically grape syrup. And so that creates a situation where when they press the grapes, what comes out is this concentration of sugar that's so great that the yeast can eat sugar until the alcohol level in the fermentation gets so high that it kills the yeast, but there's still a bunch of sugar left in the mixture. And that produces a wine that has a normal level of alcohol content but is still sweet, whereas most of the time the yeast are eating the sugar until they die from starvation because they've eaten all the sugar. There's no food left. In this case, there's still an abundance of food, but their waste product of ethanol has gotten too high and it kills the yeast. And that's why this wine is so sweet. But it does also make the wine very expensive to produce because the yields are low, because a lot of the volume of wine when you press grapes is the water that the fungus have pulled out of it. And there's also years that the crop fails because the conditions aren't right for the noble rot to take place. And so that's part of the reason why these barrels are so hard to get a hold of. The age on this, it's non-age stated, but they did disclose on their website that the whiskey was finished for 8 months in the Sauternes barrels. And they specifically said that the months were June through February. The proof is 105 proof. The SRP on this is $69.99, and it is a 750 milliliter bottle. So without further ado, let's taste this bad boy. So on the nose, this is going to sound crazy, but I'm getting something that's actually reminiscent of Blanton's, which I get a peach note on the nose. This is kind of a peach forward. You know, some people just say stone fruit, but I hate using that tasting note because stone fruit means a fruit with a pit. And that could be anything from cherries to peaches to apricots to avocados or even coffee. So I like to get a little bit more specific. So for me, this is peach. On the palate, that peach comes through, but there's another sweet flavor that's like a concentration. It's like a dried fruit flavor, and I think that's probably from the Sauternes because the Sauternes is obviously a concentration of the grape flavors. And so I wouldn't be opposed to saying that it's in the direction of a raisin, but not red raisins, like the lighter raisins that you see. It's more in the direction of that. And there's a flavor that's coming through for me, and I'm not exactly sure where it's coming from because I've had Sauternes wine before, and botrytis infected wine has a smoke flavor for me. And this does have a smoke flavor, but there's also a little bit of overlap with what I'd characterize as sulfur, almost like if you put a matchstick in your mouth. And so that could either be from the influence of the Sauternes, or there are times where barrels that are coming from Europe over to the United States for finishing, they get treated with a sulfite solution to keep them from growing microbes during the transport process. And most people can't taste that, but I'm very sensitive to that compound and I can taste it, although it's not very strong in this. So I don't know whether or not it's the smokiness from the Sauternes or if it's actually sulfites. And there's a little bit of a bitter flavor that I'm guessing is the oak tannins. Even though these were air-dried staves, the oak still had that opportunity to add that bitterness in there. But I will say that this is not as sweet as I would have expected from a Sauternes finish, because when you drink Sauternes wine, most Sauternes are sold in a half bottle of 375 instead of a 750, and that's because you probably wouldn't sit down and drink a full 6 ounces, which is a normal serving for wine, of a Sauternes, because it's just so thick and unctuous and rich. And I thought that it would make this whiskey sweeter than it's coming across, which is great because I don't like super sweet whiskeys. Same reason I don't drink a lot of sweet whiskey cocktails. It's just not for my palate. So how would I rate this one? I'm going to give this one an 86. Solid score for this guy. Really tasty. Now, would I consider this a buy or a pass? At this SRP, given the rarity of this finish, I'm going to rate this one a buy. I would certainly buy this one. It's a solid drinker. It's an interesting thing to have around the house. I don't know that it's sweet enough. I probably wouldn't pair this with dessert. I wouldn't call this a dessert whiskey, but it's certainly complex and interesting enough that it'd be a good thing to have around. So, hope you enjoyed this. We always give away a little bit of whiskey, and since this bottle was donated to the cause, I figured I'd just give away 5 2-ounce samples of this bottle so that you can try it at home. And all you have to do to enter to win this free giveaway is to like this video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, which is going to notify you of future content pieces, but also future giveaways because we give something away on every video. And then go to the YouTube channel, and underneath the playhead, there's the video description, and in there's a link that says free giveaway, and you can click it and enter in your basic contact information. We'll run a randomizer, post the results publicly online so that there's some accountability, and reach out to the winner and get your shipping information, and we'll ship you your sample absolutely for free. And if you like this content and you want to consider supporting the channel, we do have a Patreon, and we have levels for all different budgets, and it's not just a one-way street. There are benefits. We do a lot of things with our Patreon supporters. There's online events, there's in-person events, there's single barrels, there are curated trips that we go on. There's a lot of benefits for the Patreon members, so go check that out. We also have a lot of great merchandise at bourbonrealtalk.com, and it's all merch that's been created by whiskey people for whiskey people, and I'm sure you're going to find something you think is amazing if you go over there. And then last but not least, I'm a residential real estate agent, and my real estate business has subsidized the creation of this content since the beginning of the channel. And so if you are looking to buy or sell a house in the Dallas or Houston metro areas, I would love to interview for the job, and if we end up closing a deal, I will give you an epic bottle as a closing gift. Now, if this is your first time tuning into the channel, I want to tell you why we do all of the things that we do. And yes, we love whiskey, and yes, we love educating people, but ultimately the real purpose of what we're doing is to create community and connection, because I lost a loved one to suicide. And my younger brother had lost a lot of the community that kept him bound to this world. And after his passing, I was looking for opportunities to try and help others to not feel the way that he felt when he made that decision. And I learned just through being involved in the whiskey enthusiast community that whiskey has a tendency to bring people together. And I thought maybe if I could get you connected to whiskey, whiskey would do the rest of the job and get you connected to others. But if you want to create connection, you do have to have a way for people to interact. And a lot of the forums were negative, and they had what we call whiskey trolls trying to ruin everybody's good time in there. And so we ended up starting our own community called Bourbon Real Talk Community, where we filter out all of the trolls, and everything is about community and connection and being positive and, educating each other and being there for one another. And that's been very successful, and we are able to parlay that into starting our own suicide prevention nonprofit called Live Stay Project. That is why a lot of people decide to support in Patreon, because it's not just about supporting this content, it's about a bigger vision of bringing people together. But I will say that not only did the negativity that we saw in other forums motivate us to start that other platform, but they also taught us that if those individuals can hate people online that they don't know, there's nothing that keeps me from loving someone online that I don't know. And that's why we end every episode the same way, and that's this. If you woke up this morning and you're unsure whether or not anyone loved you, just know that I love you. And I'll see you next time on Bourbon Real Talk. Cheers.